Hello everyone, today we will follow the glittering footsteps of a man who owned half of Rome, and still wanted more. Imagine this: marble halls echoing with the clink of coin, firelight dancing off vaults of silver and gold, and at the center of it all one man. Marcus Licinius Crassus. The richest Roman who ever lived. But behind his wealth, something darker stirred. A hunger no treasure could satisfy. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, share your thoughts in the comments. Was it greed that destroyed him, or ambition? In the shadowed alleys of Rome, Crassus was a name whispered with both awe and disdain. Born into privilege, he was not the son of poverty clawing his way upward. He was the son of a consul. But what made Crassus truly terrifying was not his birthright. It was his appetite. When Rome burned, Crassus profited. Quite literally. As fires swept through districts of the city, he would send his private brigade, not to douse the flames, but to negotiate. Homeowners, desperate to save their property, were offered a choice: sell at a pittance, or watch it all turn to ash. Crassus bought low, rebuilt, and rented out at exorbitant rates. Block by block, he turned misfortune into an empire of stone. But property was only the beginning. He financed gladiator schools. He loaned money to senators at ruinous interest rates. He bankrolled political campaigns, and then collected favors like coins. Behind every whispered deal in the Senate, behind every shadowed hand that guided Rome's fate, there was often Crassus. And yet, despite owning more wealth than some kingdoms, Crassus was not satisfied. Because in Rome, gold alone did not confer immortality. Glory did. And in that measure, Crassus found himself overshadowed by Pompey, beloved by the people, conqueror of the East. And worse still, by Julius Caesar, charming, brilliant, and worshipped like a demigod. Crassus had money, yes. But in the streets of Rome, the crowds did not chant his name. In the histories being written, he was a footnote. A financier. Never a hero. This imbalance gnawed at him. Every statue of Caesar, every parade for Pompey, every Senate speech praising others, was a blade to Crassus's pride. So he bought his way into history. The first triumvirate was born, not of unity, but necessity. 3 men: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. One had popularity, one had military might, and one had wealth. It was a pact of power, a triangle balanced only by mutual distrust. Crassus had finally placed himself on equal footing with Rome's titans. But it wasn't enough. Because even then, after the deals, the land, the secret meetings, Crassus remained a man defined by what he lacked. He had conquered no foreign king. He had not draped his shoulders in eastern silk, or marched in triumph through Rome's gates with chained captives behind him. He was rich, but not legendary. And so, he looked east. To Parthia. A kingdom as old as Rome, as proud, and, perhaps most alluringly, as rich. Parthia was the perfect target. Not only for its gold, but for its symbolism. Conquering it would silence every senator who doubted him. Every general who mocked his lack of valor. Every historian who would otherwise write him off as a banker with delusions of grandeur. But to reach that glory, Crassus would need more than ambition. He would need an army. And a plan. And the ability to see past the glitter of imagined victory to the blood it would cost. Unfortunately for him, and for Rome, Crassus had grown used to buying his victories. And Parthia was not for sale. The sun rose crimson over the city of Rome the day Crassus set out for war, casting long shadows over marble rooftops and crowded forums. His soldiers, most of them bought with coin rather than loyalty, marched behind him in gleaming armor, their weapons polished but untested. This was no seasoned legion hardened by years of conquest like Caesar's in Gaul. This was an army forged in the vaults of Roman banks, drawn together by promise of spoils rather than patriotism. Crassus had never led a campaign like this. True, he had quelled the Spartacus rebellion years earlier, crucifying thousands along the Appian Way. But those had been slaves, rebels, not a foreign empire with cavalry that moved like lightning and archers who could darken the skies. Parthia was a different beast entirely. And yet, blinded by ambition, Crassus marched eastward as if victory were inevitable. He did not consult Rome's generals. He dismissed warnings from seasoned advisers. Even when omens grew troubling, when a priest dropped the sacred entrails in ritual, when a thunderclap split the sky at midday, Crassus scoffed. Superstition was for the poor. He had wealth. He had numbers. And soon, he would have glory. Crossing into Syria, he took command of legions stationed there, reinforcing them with mercenaries and fresh recruits. Governors tried to warn him. The Parthians did not fight like Gauls or Greeks. Their warfare was not about brute force, but speed and deception. Their cataphracts, heavily armored horsemen, were unlike anything Roman infantry had ever faced. And their horse archers? Ghosts in the desert, loosing arrows and deadly arcs before vanishing into dust. Crassus waved it all away. He was already dreaming of his triumph, the golden crown, the cheering crowds, his name etched in marble alongside Alexander's. He even rejected sound strategic advice to coordinate with Rome's eastern allies. He did not need allies. He needed credit. Every action was a march toward that singular prize, undivided recognition. And so, into the desert he went. The Parthians were waiting. Led by General Serena, they numbered fewer than Crassus's legions. But they had the land, the tactics, the patience, and something else, disdain. To the Parthians, Crassus was a merchant pretending to be a soldier. A man who thought coin could buy fate. At first, the Roman advance was slow but steady. The terrain, flat, featureless, and brutally hot, offered no shelter. Supplies dwindled. The sun turned soldiers' armor into ovens. Morale slipped. Then came the messengers. Parthian envoys arrived under banners of peace, offering terms. Crassus, proud and suspicious, sent them away with insults. "I will give my reply in Seleucia," he sneered, naming a city deep in Parthian territory. He didn't realize then, he was being drawn in. Pulled into the sands, deeper and deeper, away from supply lines, toward a battlefield chosen by someone else. Carry. A nondescript plain near the edge of Roman reach. It was here, under a punishing sun and a sky that offered no mercy, that Crassus led his men into a trap. The Parthians did not charge. They encircled. Their drums began to beat, a deep, rhythmic sound that echoed across the flat earth like the heartbeat of death. Then came the arrows. Tens of thousands. Falling in arcs. Screaming through the air like a storm of wasps. Roman shields held at first, but the arrows never ceased. It wasn't a wave, it was a rain. Endlessly falling, endlessly killing. The Roman formations broke. Crassus tried to rally them, but the enemy moved too quickly. Every time the legions advanced, the Parthians slipped away, loosing more arrows. The cavalry tried to engage, only to be crushed by Serena's cataphracts, armored giants who trampled men like wheat beneath hooves. The heat, the panic, the endless assault, it broke the Roman will. By nightfall, thousands lay dead. Entire cohorts had vanished. And still, no Parthian blade had clashed with Roman steel. They had killed from a distance. Cold. Precise. Crassus set up camp, stunned, bleeding, and surrounded. He had come for glory. Now he only hoped for survival. The camp at Carrhae was silent, except for the moaning of the wounded and the restless shifting of terrified men. Fires burned low. The wind carried dust, blood, and the faint echo of drums. The Parthians were still out there, encircling like wolves. But they didn't attack. They didn't need to. Crassus had already done most of their work for them. His army, once tens of thousands strong, was now a fractured, exhausted shell. Morale had collapsed. Some soldiers murmured of surrender. Others tried to desert, slipping off into the night, only to vanish into the uncharted sands, swallowed by heat and horror. The Parthians didn't chase. They simply waited. Their patience was terrifying. Inside his tent, Crassus sat motionless, staring at maps that no longer meant anything. Lines drawn in ink that had once represented triumph now mocked him. Every road marked a retreat. Every city he once dreamed of conquering had become unreachable. It was not just his campaign that had failed. It was his vision. His belief that wealth and ambition were enough to bend the world to his will. But Rome had not yet heard of his fall. He still had one final choice: escape or negotiate. His officers were divided. Some, like Cassius, yes, that Cassius, future assassin of Caesar, urged retreat to the Armenian highlands. There, they could regroup and return home with what remained. Others, cowed by fear or desperation, whispered of surrender. Crassus listened to either. He could not return to Rome in disgrace. Better, perhaps, to gamble once more. So he placed his trust in Parthian envoys. Surina, master of deception, sent men bearing gifts and promises. Safe passage. Honorable terms. An end to bloodshed. Crassus, out of options, out of hope, agreed to meet. The next day, beneath the desert sky, Crassus rode out with his officers. The Parthians approached slowly, grandly, their horses cloaked in armor, their standards shimmering in the heat. In the center rode Surina, draped in silk, his face unreadable beneath a golden helmet. The two sides met on foot. Formalities were exchanged. A treaty was presented. Crassus, exhausted and unsure, hesitated. Then chaos. Accounts differ. Some say a scuffle broke out when one of Crassus's men struck a Parthian. Others say Surina offered Crassus a forced escort, and the Romans resisted. Whatever the spark, it ended the same: a sudden burst of violence, swords drawn, and Crassus dragged away into the desert. His officers, those not immediately killed, fled back to camp in panic. The army, leaderless and terrified, dissolved overnight. Some surrendered. Others scattered. Only a lucky few escaped carry alive. It would go down as one of the greatest defeats in Roman history: nearly 20,000 dead, another 10,000 taken prisoner, and Rome's aura of invincibility shattered. And Crassus? He was taken to the Parthian camp, a prisoner. But not for long. For Surina had a sense of theater. A mock parade was staged. Roman prisoners were forced to play the roles of soldiers, while Crassus, bound and humiliated, was made to wear women's clothing. Parthian crowds jeered. The man who had once owned half of Rome now stood as a trophy, a cautionary tale dressed in silk. But Surina wasn't finished. Crassus had come to Parthia for gold. He had weighed his worth in coin. So Surina decided to give him what he wanted, more than he could ever spend. A molten pot was prepared. Gold, melted until it shone like the sun, blinding in its intensity. Crassus was held down. And then, in the most poetic of executions, the molten metal was poured, not into a wound, nor onto his skin, but into his mouth. The man who had spoken so often of wealth, who had silenced rivals with silver, who had once declared that no man was truly powerful unless he could build his own army, was now silent forever, choked by the very thing he worshipped. When word finally reached Rome, the shock was immediate. Some wept. Others scoffed. But all understood what it meant: a titan had fallen. And the East had teeth. Crassus's name was not etched in victory columns. No triumph was ever held for him. No temple bore his likeness. He had left seeking immortality, and returned a ghost, his legacy scorched by molten gold and desert failure. But in that silence, he became something else. A warning. As the Parthians returned to their lands with the spoils of victory and a corpse dressed in ridicule, Rome was left reeling. Crassus's death at Carrhae wasn't just a personal failure, it was a fracture in the fragile equilibrium of the Republic. With one corner of the triumvirate burned away like wax under a flame, balance had been lost. Whispers began to stir in the Senate halls. Some blamed Crassus for his arrogance, his greed, his reckless march into a foreign land without Senate approval. Others saw a darker omen. Rome's expansion had reached too far, too fast. And still others, more cunning, saw an opportunity. Caesar, stationed in Gaul, received the news with a careful silence. Pompey, in Rome, projected public grief but privately felt something else: relief. Without Crassus, there was no longer a third man to keep the scales level between Caesar's ambitions and his own. The uneasy alliance had died in the dust of Parthia. Back in the east, the Parthians celebrated a symbolic victory. Crassus's golden execution became legend, a tale told in marketplaces and palaces alike. But more than gold, they had won something priceless: fear. The mighty Rome had bled, and bled heavily. Parthia now stood not just as a rival, but as a mirror, an empire just as enduring, just as formidable, whose desert winds could strip legions bare. And what of the men who survived? Scattered across Mesopotamia, thousands of Roman soldiers were taken captive, not executed, but relocated. Parthian kings, practical and strategic, dispersed them across distant regions, using them as border guards, or integrating them into faraway cities. Some historians would later suggest these men ended up deep in Central Asia, their Roman traditions slowly fading, absorbed by new cultures. But the ghost of Crassus lingered. In Rome, statues once planned in his honor were left unfinished. His vast estate, so carefully curated, was picked over by rivals. His sons attempted to salvage the family name, but their father's shadow loomed too large. There were no plays written for him, no hymns sung in his memory. His life had been defined by acquisition, and in the end, even memory slipped through his fingers. And yet, the story refused to die. Not because of his victories, he had too few. Not because of his charisma, he had none. But because his ending was too perfect in its symbolism. The richest man in Rome. The one who believed wealth was power. The one who thought he could buy loyalty, destiny, even legacy. He died with gold searing his throat shut. He died in a land he never understood, at the hands of men he underestimated, in pursuit of a glory that would never bear his name. Even centuries later, emperors would recall Carrhae as a lesson. Not of battlefield tactics. Not of political missteps. But of what happens when ambition outpaces wisdom, when a man who owns the world still craves more, and walks blindly into his own destruction. It would have been easy to forget Crassus. He had no fanfare, no grand mausoleum, no heroic standoff. But perhaps, in the quiet terror of his downfall, he secured something more lasting than fame. He became a parable. And parables, especially the ones that end in molten gold, are not easily forgotten. The years rolled on, and Rome, as it always did, turned its face to new ambitions. The Republic would unravel, Caesar would cross the Rubicon, Pompey would fall, and emperors would rise and burn like falling stars. But through it all, the name Crassus remained, a whispered lesson in marble corridors, a ghost clinging to the Senate walls. For those who study power, Crassus was a mirror they didn't want to gaze into too long. He had it all: land, influence, control over fire brigades, gladiators, and senators alike. He didn't need to fight. He could have remained the richest man in Rome, a puppet master behind the curtain, forever untouched by the blood and sand of foreign wars. But that wasn't enough. Because in his mind, wealth was supposed to open every door, even the ones locked by destiny. He couldn't understand that some doors only open through blood, not gold. And that misunderstanding led him to Carrhae. To the desert. To betrayal. To humiliation. To the very edge of human punishment. It wasn't just the molten gold that killed Crassus. It was the years of believing he could cheat greatness. That he could take a shortcut through history by buying the things others earned in battlefields and exile. That fate could be bribed. But fate does not take bribes. It waits. It watches. And when it strikes in silence, like Parthian arrows through the sky. There's a reason the story of Crassus is still told, sometimes embellished, sometimes stripped raw, but always ending the same. The golden mouth. The defeated army. The desert sun. In modern times, when people warn of the dangers of unchecked greed, his name still surfaces. He's invoked in political discourse, in studies of ancient leadership, and in tales of financial ruin. Not because he was evil. Not because he was good. But because he was human, and his flaws were magnified by the scale of his wealth. In the East, the Parthians added his tale to their own annals, proud of the day they humbled a Roman giant. In the West, his life became a warning label for ambition. Do not seek what you do not understand. Do not chase legacies forged by others unless you're willing to bleed as they did. And in the ruins of Carrhae, beneath shifting sands and long-buried bones, echoes remain. Not of speeches or triumphs, but of a silent scream, frozen in molten gold. So if you walk the desert winds, and feel the sun too hot on your face, listen. You may hear drums that no longer beat, and hooves that no longer thunder. You may hear the rustle of silk and the hiss of molten dreams cooling in the throat of a man who thought he could outshine history. Hello everyone, if you've made it this far, thank you. These stories remind us that history is not just dates and empires. It's pride. It's fear. It's longing. And sometimes, it's one man, standing beneath a foreign sky, learning, too late, that you cannot buy immortality. If this story gave you chills, or made you think, please like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments, if you had the wealth of Crassus, would you have risked it all for fame? Or would you have walked away?